Hola, bienvenidos a este especial de Palabra Pública. Esta semana estuvimos conversando con Natalia Melnyk, director de comunicaciones del Bendukidze Free Market Institute en Ucrania, y Adam Bertha, director de Epicenter e investigador del Instituto de Asuntos Económicos de Londres. En 2021, el presidente ucraniano Zelensky pidió la incorporación de Ucrania como miembro de la OTAN. Recordemos que la Organización de Tratados del Atlántico Norte es una alianza militar intergubernamental que promueve la defensa colectiva, originalmente contra Rusia, pero en general contra cualquier enemigo que amenace a los países miembros de la OTAN. Biden, por otro lado, ha insistido con la idea de que la guerra es inminente, que está a la vuelta de la esquina. Cuestión que ya ha comenzado a molestar a quienes buscan resolver este asunto por la vía diplomática. También hemos estado escuchando las estimaciones sobre el número de personas que resultarían muertas si el conflicto escalase oficialmente hacia una invasión y posteriormente una guerra. Las cifras nos hablan de alrededor de 50.000 civiles ucranianos que morirían, 25.000 soldados también ucranianos que serían, digamos, caerían a través de la guerra, 10.000 soldados rusos que morirían, pero también nos habla de millones de personas que se desplazarían a países europeos en busca de refugio. Y bueno, una de las cuestiones importantes también fue que la vicepresidenta de Estados Unidos, Kamala Harris, anunció un número de sanciones económicas que ella calificó como sin precedentes, que impondrán sobre Rusia si es que ésta decide atacar. En términos de teoría de juego, lo que están creando acá es una suerte de juego de la gallina, donde la constante demostración de quién es el más alfa del juego podría terminar empujando a Putin a iniciar el conflicto no por una falsa bandera o un nacionalismo patológico, sino que por una cuestión de credibilidad internacional. Con toda esta tensión, ¿cómo están viviendo el día a día los ucranianos? Una población que, como nos cuenta Natalia, están acostumbrados a ser amenazados por su vecino del este. ¿Cuáles son los sentimientos y angustia que viven las personas más allá? Natalia nos sorprende con una respuesta. Pero antes de escucharla, agradecemos a la revista Individuo, a Hayek Labs y Econintech por su apoyo en difundir las ideas de la libertad. Ahora sí, escuchemos a Natalia.
Yes, so if you are trying, to stay updated on what's happening in Ukraine by reading foreign media, you might have this like really grim picture of what Ukrainians, must be feeling or how they must be reacting. And if you actually come here, you might be a bit surprised to see what's going on, because that's not something you would normally expect of people of a country that is about to be invaded. But the thing is, this is nothing new to us, to tell you the truth, and not a new development, not something unexpected, because we have been living with this active threat for the past 8 years. So you could say that we are quite a bit stress resistant right now, especially when this stress and anxiety is coming from our neighbor to the east. Mm-hmm. So basically for us, this is not something that's about to happen out of the blue. It's just another escalation of the same problem we've been dealing with. And we are just used to being threatened so much that we have a certain level of tolerance. That's why out on the street, you will see people going about their business or entertaining themselves, or staying quarantined because, the COVID numbers are still rather high in the country. So basically, you will see that concerts, different shows are sold out, nightclubs are filled with people. People are trying to basically maybe partly distract themselves from the onslaught of negative media coming in, or just, adding some extra things that would be reflective of the situation. So you will see that shooting ranges are completely booked for the foreseeable future, not just in Kiev, but even in the nearby towns. First aid classes are also booked for the next couple of months. So I can't say, and it wouldn't be fair to say that Ukrainians are ignoring the threat. No, they're not. They're preparing to it to the best of their abilities without putting their normal lives on pause.
Europa parece estar dividida entre los países que ven en toda esta situación una real amenaza de guerra y abiertamente ayudan a Ucrania y condenan a Rusia, y otros países que son más prudentes y que buscan suavizar por medio de la diplomacia todo este entuerto. ¿Está Europa dividida? Le preguntamos a Adam Bertha esta pregunta, quien tiene un punto de vista distinto al que le planteamos.
Future of this conflict.
Well, first of all, heartfelt solidarity to Natalia and all our Ukrainian friends. I'm glad to hear that everyone is kind of in reasonably good spirits, but it must be a very stressful situation just to live under, well, constant possible escalation of war for the last almost decade or so. In regards to your Western European neighbors, Francisco, I'm not entirely sure that I agree with your description that the West is divided on this issue. I think in terms of communications, you're right. The UK and the US is much harsher and much more outspoken. The French and German governments are trying to be a bit more reserved and a bit more ingrained to use diplomatic language. But at the end of the day, I think the issue is the same, both from a UK and from a German or French perspective. None of the European countries are willing to engage in direct war. None of them would be willing to send their own men and their own women to the battle lines. So they're trying to find a solution that basically tries to support the Ukraine, but doesn't go as far as direct escalation of war. I think that's incredibly tricky to do. At this point, this is very, very difficult to do, simply because a lot of the Western countries in the last couple of years, since the Crimea crisis, they have been pretending to be able to help Ukraine more than they're able to. I don't necessarily like historical parallels, but my home country, Hungary, has been indeed invaded and occupied by Russia for 45 years. And in 1956, the Hungarian Revolution basically started with the hope of the US and Western European countries helping Hungarians. It didn't happen back then, and I think it's unlikely to happen right now. This is obviously very bad news from one angle. Basically, Ukraine and our Ukrainian friends are not completely alone and not completely by themselves, but definitely a lot more affected than any other European country. So at the moment, the best that I think most European countries are willing to do is to support Ukraine either with weapons, with financial aid, or with threats of further economic sanctions on the Putin regime. I think it's very unlikely that any European country at this point would be willing to escalate the crisis into a full outright war between nuclear powers. UK, France, Russia all have the bomb. So I can't really imagine a possible direct escalation between these countries.
¿Qué rol juega la prosperidad de Ucrania como bandera roja para Rusia o bandera de alerta, digamos? ¿Cómo encaja en todo esto el factor OTAN? ¿Y qué otros factores están detrás de esta crisis que algunos califican como una guerra que comenzó hace casi una década atrás, desde la usurpación de Crimea por parte de Rusia? Por otro lado, recordemos que los separatistas rusos han estado incitando a la guerra estos últimos días, atacando a las fuerzas ucranianas sin recibir artillería de vuelta, pero matando a 2 ucranianos.
Well, this is what we need to understand here is the NATO factor, or not wanting Ukraine to join the alliance, is just a formal reason for this escalation, which is not like nearly able to explain the whole situation. But what they're officially saying, the signals they're sending, the messages they're putting out, is that as soon as Ukraine joins the NATO, it will use the NATO to return Crimea, which is part of Ukraine that was occupied and seized by Russia and essentially added to the territory of the Russian Federation. Basically, Russians want guarantees that NATO will not expand further into their area of interest, basically the post-Soviet countries, and thus removing basically part of sovereignty of those countries, who are free to decide whether they want to become part of NATO or not, right? This is not something that Russia should be deciding. That's one thing. The other thing is that Russia is not happy with NATO's increasing its presence in countries that are already part of NATO. So we can look at Poland as an example, the Baltic states. So for them, it's too close for comfort, or at least that's how they're positioning it. But that's one of the things. The other thing is that this current escalation started when the negotiations with the West and negotiations with Ukraine as part of Minsk talks, they stalled. So to somehow move them along, but along the way that Russia wants, they decided to basically revert to their usual tactics and threaten someone. And in this case, well, they threatened Ukraine. And usually Ukraine is the punching bag in this situation because of our situation in the eastern Ukraine, where we have parts of Ukrainian territories basically being controlled by the Russian Federation. And the idea is the following. Russia needs Ukraine weak and within its sphere of control. Ukraine is a great resource country. It's a big resource country. So this is not a local issue at all. And basically, Ukraine is, I think, third in the world when it comes to black soil, which is extremely important for high efficiency agriculture. And it's fourth in the world when it comes to the value of resources that's in the country. And Russia is used to being the puppet master of Ukraine. And since 2013, we basically showed that, no, we want to decide our own future. And the further we move away from Russia, the more they want to pull us back. And right now we're at the situation in which our minimum wages are higher than in Russia and in Belarus, which is sending negative signals to Russia, because when they came to, officially they didn't, come into the eastern Ukraine, but when they did, they were promising people that they will be better off, and they're not better off. And when Ukrainians become better off than Russians and Belarusians, the whole notion of Russia as a superpower and the dominating force in the region kind of devalues itself. So Russia is trying to stay relevant, and this is how Russia stays relevant, by sheer force. And this is what we see them doing right now.
I think, Natalia, you have touched on a very important issue that I completely agree with, kind of the economic development of Ukraine and how the Putin regime views it. So NATO, of course, as a military alliance, does play a role in the conflict between Ukraine and Russia. But I think the other angle is the potential integration of Ukraine into the European Union or into its sphere of influence single market, right? So before the 2014 crisis, the association agreement between the EU and Ukraine was a very hotly contested issue. And I think that very much remains on the table from the Russian perspective, exactly for the reason that Natalia explained. Basically, if Russia has a successful former Soviet member state next to its border with 45 million people, with some sort of culture and linguistic similarities, I mean, the Putin regime will just start to think, oh, what if our people realize that a liberalizing, westernizing, prospering future is also possible for them? So that directly threatens the interest of the Putin regime. It's not the interest of the Russian people themselves, it's the interest of the regime. And I think that's why Putin is very, very hard to crack down and to ensure that the kind of Russian sphere of influence remains a thing in the future, not just in the past.
Los últimos días Putin ha estado probando misiles capaces de transportar armamento nuclear. Por otro lado, aun cuando en primera instancia dijo que sus tropas se están retirando después de las prácticas militares, la verdad es que a través de fotos satelitales se observa que el ejército ruso está en posiciones de ataque y no parece haber una desescalada, al menos en cuanto a la cantidad de tropas que Putin envía hasta la frontera con Ucrania. ¿Qué pasará con los civiles si Putin invade Ucrania? ¿Por qué Putin está tan obsesionado con ese país?
Ukraine is a very big country. So even though, culturally we are Europeans, but if it were like a full-scale invasion, Ukrainian refugees would basically just flood the neighboring countries, overloading the whole system. So obviously, I can't say that all of the Ukrainians would run away, but we are talking about high numbers, millions of people. So we are preparing for war. The time, the clock is counting down because we were promised an invasion starting at 1 a.m. February 16th. We are currently under a heavy hacking attack, which is usually a bad sign. And Russia promised to move some of the units away from the border because they are done with their exercises. But so far, the satellite images are not showing any, withdrawal. So we are closely monitoring the situation. Our army is at the ready. And this is the difference, right? What Adam said is correct. European countries are doing their best to avoid the war. And at the same time, their reaction in this situation is unprecedented because the number of weapons and the level of weapons that we had never received before. And financial assurances included, to make sure that our economy survives the scare as well, because obviously, foreign investment is the first investment that leaves the country in this situation. And Ukrainians already moved almost $13 billion out of the country, which is never good for the banking system and the economy. So they are trying to increase the cost of Russian invasion. And it will be high because our army is capable compared to what it was in 2013 and 14. It's heavily armed. So it will be bloody. It will be close to the point of mutual destruction, because for us, the goal is not to avoid the war at any cost. So there are certain things we are not willing to compromise on. And if our government compromises on them, there will be another revolution in the country. And our government understands that. So there are certain things that we will not agree on. And this is where our stance is obviously different from our allies, because this is our home we are talking about. So we are ready to go to war, and we understand that it's going to be bad. And right now, the main thing that our allies can do is just to make it as costly as possible for Russia.